Welcome to Windy Night Stories. Tonight's story is by Theo. What was he? The first time. I think it was in the second week of August, 1868, that it happened. I may not be quite right about the time of the month or the month itself, but I am almost sure it was in August, and I know that it was summer, the summer of 1868, that I spent in Switzerland. We were staying at a pension kept by a Madame Priory, just outside the little town of Abondance, among the Swiss Alps. It was a charming place, a sort of big, rambling chalet, built on the wooded slope of a steep hill, commanding a glorious view of the stony mountains which framed us in on all sides but one, and looking straight down into the little town, with its picturesque jumble of red roofs and twisted chimneys, and the narrow, rock-bound river. We were a lively enough party at the chalet, Madame Priory being a pleasant woman, and having a knack of getting together young and pleasant inmates. I don't remember all of them, for they went and came, but I can recall a nice little Irish doctor, a handsome high church clergyman and his sister, who went down to early mass regularly every morning in the town below, a French marquise, middle-aged, but fascinating, a newly married couple, also French, and Helen Joyce, with whom I was traveling. I was then 26, in high health and spirits, and unmarried, while she was still wearing her widow's weeds. Indeed, it was as a help to recovering her spirits, which had been sorely tried by her husband's death, that I had agreed to spend the year in traveling with her. Unquestionably, the most fascinating members of our party were the newly married couple. They were both very young. She could scarcely have been 18, deliciously good-looking, over head and ears in love with one another, and had only been married a week. This last fact naturally made them even more the central objects of observation and curiosity than they might otherwise have been. But, indeed, the young wife was pretty and innocent enough to attract notice anywhere, fresh from the convent school, where she had passed all her young life, naive as a babe and playful as a kitten, with big black eyes, most childishly round and liquid, a little head covered with short, soft curls, and a complexion of milk and roses. The husband, however, was even more remarkable for beauty, tall and slenderly made, with a perfect oval face, long waving hair of a rich auburn color, with pointed beard and a mustache slightly deeper in tint, and the eyes the likes of which I have never seen before. They were indeed the chief feature in his face, and though I could not call them beautiful, as some did, they would have marked the man among 100 others after years of forgetfulness. If some of you think that this is an after fancy of mine, not existent at the time, but created by later impressions, you are wrong. What I say of them now I thought then, and even described them in a letter which is still extant. Eyes not large, but looking so, from a singular power of dilation in the pupil, produced by any intensity of feeling, pleasant or the reverse, whites very convex, and with the dazzlingly opaque brilliance of porcelain, iris of a bright golden color, surrounded by an outer ring of deep greenish gray, the whole shaded and made additionally noticeable by the straight, sharply penciled brows, inky black, and slightly depressed towards the nose, a peculiarity which became intensified whenever their owner was excited to either irony or vexation, and which lent a curious and, to me, somewhat unpleasant expression to his face. The other ladies voted him as handsome as an archangel. Mr. Hume, our clergyman, suggested, half laughingly, a fallen one. But whatever our opinions might be, they mattered very little to the subject of them. Those weirdly brilliant eyes of his, with their orange tawny light, a light which seemed to come from within, like those of the leopard and the nighthawk, had vision for nothing but the charming face of his wife, while her innocent gaze seemed to lose itself in wondering admiration as it rested on him. They were ridiculously in love with one another. We had been talking about the glaciers one day at the table d'hôte. He had often been in Switzerland before, and was describing some of his feats in alpine climbing, while his girl wife listened delightedly, and now and then put in a whisper to one of us. Ne sais pas qu'il tout a fait Montegarde, mon mari? Later in the evening, I happened to be out in the garden. It was not a large one, but had the effect of being so, from being laid out in a succession of terraces cut out of the steep hillside, and planted thickly with all manner of flowering shrubs and fragrant, bright-hued blossoms. Strolling along the upper of these terraces, I was gazing out to where the great white mountains showed forth against the sapphire sky, set thick with golden star gleams, and inhaling the delicious fragrance of the pine woods on the other side of the little river at our feet, when I became aware of the presence of our young lovers on the path below me. They were chatting in a little nook formed by a bench and the angle of the wall, he half kneeling on the former, and supporting her as she sat on the wall, her little feet crossed and hanging down in front of her, her slender childish figure pressed against his shoulder. She had on a black lace frock, cut so as to leave the neck and arms bare, and her pretty shoulders, charmingly white and dimpled, gleamed like soft mounds of snow in the moonlight. "Eh bien, mon chéri," I could hear her saying in her clear little child voice. "Tomorrow, then, thou wilt take me up to the mountains, and show me where to pick the edelweiss, to show my mother when we return?" "If we can find a guide," the husband answered. "But they say one ought to engage them the day before. There are so many excursionists here at present." The little bride pouted, and struck him a playful blow on the mouth with a bunch of heliotrope which she held in her hand. The perfume crushed against his lips rose up to me in a sweet, sharp puff. "Guides? Guides? What do we want with guides? Have you not told me how well you know these mountains, and how often you have been over them alone? You shall be my guide, Henri. I want no others. Point to strangers. But suppose any accident should happen to you, petite angel." "Accident? What accident? We are not going up Mont Blanc, and the pasteur Anglais takes his sister always with him. Si tu me crois patron, moi, je te crois adorable," he answered, and, stooping down, lifted her little sandaled toe and kissed it. I thought it time to retire, and did so, but there had been no vulgar curiosity in my staying so long. They did their love-making perfectly openly, and there were several others besides me enjoying the perfumed air on those terraced walks. Next evening, when we came home from our drive, we found the whole pension in a state of greatest excitement and confusion. The Marquis was in hysterics, Miss Hume's maid crying bitterly in the hall, while Madame, pale as death, and with her hair all limp and unfrizzled, was giving distracted orders to half a dozen servants at once. She could only answer our questions in incoherent ejaculations. The most frightful accident, our dear young bride and bridegroom. Alas, that poor man! No, no, it was not he. It was his wife, that charming, fresh, all-adorable child. She had ventured too near a crevasse to pluck a flower. The piece of snow on which she stood, loosened by the late rains, had slipped and she had fallen. Heaven preserve us, it was too horrible to think of. Someone had heard the cries of the poor husband, and had come to the rescue, but it was too late. She was dead, dead. They were bringing her body home now. And the poor husband? Hélas, why ask? They said he had tried to kill himself, too. The guides who lifted her from the crevasse had to restrain him by force from flinging himself in. It was too true. That same night, Miss Hume and I went to see the body. It had been laid out in a lower room, and hearing that the poor child's mother had been telegraphed for, we had gathered all the white flowers we could find to strew about the corpse, and so soften the sorrowful sight to those to whom it might have been agony to gaze upon it. It was a far more terrible one to us than we had expected. Not that there were any horrible facial wounds or disfigurement. Curiously enough, as the servants had already told us, there was not a broken bone or bruise on the whole body. Indeed, it must have been the mere shock of falling from such a giddy height that killed her, for she was found, quite uninjured outwardly, lying on a bed of soft snow at the bottom of the crevasse. But to look on the expression of her young face, one would have thought she had died in the most awful agony, so ghastly was the look frozen there in death, a look, not of pain, but of unutterable, indescribable fear, of frenzied horror and repulsion, while the tiny waxen hands which some pious soul had tried to bind together crosswise on the breast were bent backwards, with the stiffened fingers curving towards the palm, as though warding off some sudden unimaginable horror. Miss Hume could hardly bear the sight. She put her hand over the contorted features, and said faintly, "Oh, would not one think there was no loving God behind death when a little girl can meet it too? Fancy a mother having only that look to remember her child's face by. Has no one a veil to cover it?" I said I had, and, sending her away, for she was quite unnerved, went to get it. When I returned, I forgot to bring a candle with me, and found the room in darkness, save for a broad stripe of moonlight falling through a window at one end of it upon the bier, with its slender white-robed occupant, which stood in the center of the floor. Not thinking that there was anyone else in the room, I was going in softly when I stepped back, shocked and startled at finding myself in the presence of the widower. He had not seen me. He was standing on the farther side of the bier, his tall figure slightly bent over it, his arms raised high above his head, and the hands wreathed together and waving to and fro, as if in utterance of some prayer or malediction against the woe which had befallen him, while, though the spot where he stood was all the darker for being just outside that one ray of light, I could see his eyes dilated to double their usual size, and blazing like two unearthly lamps with a ghastly yellow glare, which seemed to positively irradiate the dark and tortured face beneath them. Fully believing that the man had gone out of his mind with grief, I fled, pale and terrified, to my room, where I found Helen's maid was already packing our things for going. She said that, considering the state of her mistress's health and spirits, she had persuaded her not to remain in a house with death so soon after her own sad loss, and that, after some discussion, Helen had agreed to leave on the morrow. I was not sorry to hear it. The second time. Well, be sure and call me if I can be of any use, Mrs. Critchett. I will, ma'am, thank you, and glad I should be able to do so if it were in the night, and the nurse not here. They have engaged one. I have made a point of it when I let 'em the rooms, seeing how that was a thing I could not feel called on for, with my other lodgers to see to and all. But from what she says now, I shouldn't be a bit surprised if it was before the time. Has she no mother, Mrs. Critchett? She has not, ma'am, which is maybe the reason I feel for her, being young, too, as I said, and more ignorant of the world and its wickedness than 9 out of 10 girls nowadays. A most pious and godly a young creature as I ever see, and not over-strong. Sits there doing her bits of sewing for the baby as is coming, with her Bible on her knee all day, and sleeps with it under her pillow at night. Even my husband, he says it's as good as reading a chapter to hear her talk. Which, no offense to you, ma'am, all the same, as of course she is nothing but a Quaker, which naturally you, being a clergyman's wife, might object to have anything to do with. I would object to myself very much, Mrs. Critchett, if I had any such feeling, or my husband either. So don't forget to mention to your young lodger that if she feels nervous or ailing, there is a lady upstairs who will be very glad to come and see her, or help her in any way. It was the winter of 1875. I had been married nearly 6 years, and John and I were living in lodgings in Guildford Street, Bloomsbury. I should have preferred a house of my own, but circumstances made lodging more practical to us just then, and these were very clean and comfortable, and kept by an exceedingly worthy woman. We had the drawing rooms and the best bedrooms above, and besides us, there were in the house 3 other lodgers, a clerk in some city house and his wife, who occupied the dining rooms, and a queer old bachelor, who lived in one room at the top of the house, and whom we had never yet seen, though he was an older resident than ourselves, and we had lived with Mrs. Cratchit for over 3 years. As for the couple downstairs, they'd only been there for 3 months, and all I knew of them was that I used to get a glimpse of him now and then, going into the city of a morning, a stoutish, thick-set young man, with light hair and a florid complexion, that he and his wife had not been married long, and that she was understood to be in a delicate state of health. Probably for that reason she went out very seldom, except after dusk, and leaning on her husband's arm, and though I passed her 2 or 3 times on the staircase, or at the door of her room, I had no very distinct impression of her, save of a fair, slenderly made young woman, with a very good, pure-looking face, to which her simple dove-colored gowns and muslin caps lent a certain soft attractiveness. My offer to be of any service to her in her trouble, however, had not come a day too soon, for that very night the summons arrived. About 9 o'clock Mrs. Critchett came running to tell me that poor Mrs. Page was took bad. Her husband had gone for the nurse and doctor, and would I mind stepping down and comforting her a bit? Of course I went. There was not very much for me to do, however, though my inclination to do it was enhanced now that I had the time to appreciate more thoroughly the absolute beauty of holiness shining from the pale young face which I saw lying so patiently on its pillows below. She was very weak, and suffering a great deal, but she made no complaint or fuss, and indeed hardly spoke. When the doctor arrived, he said all was going on as well as possible, and indeed, a very few minutes after Mr. Page returned with the nurse, who lived at the other side of London, and who had not expected to be wanted so soon, everything was over, and there was a tiny citizen the more in the world. I had gone back to my own rooms by then, not wishing to be in the way, and thinking that between husband, nurse, doctor, and landlady, those very small apartments downstairs would be sufficiently tenanted. Indeed, I was in the act of telling John, who had just come in, all about it, and what a nice, gentle creature the young Quaker wife seemed to be, when the stillness which had followed pleasantly on the late bustle and upset in the house was broken by a sudden hoarse shriek, and then an opening and shutting of doors, and the sound of footsteps hurrying to and fro. "Something is wrong. What can it be, John?" I said, getting up and looking apprehensively at my husband, and almost in the same moment Mrs. Critchett's maid came to the door with a breathless message. "Oh, if you please, ma'am. Mrs. says could you come at once? She thinks Mrs. Page is going." Going? By the time I got from my room to hers, it was plain that she was so far gone that the eyes into which mine looked would never know me or any earthly thing again on this side of the grave. In sober truth, I hardly knew her. The apartment had been tidied and put straight. There was a pleasant glow of fire and lamplight in it, the latter carefully shaded from the face which lay back upon its pillows, just as I had left it barely an hour ago. But during that short time such a change had come over the features as no mere womanish pain or distress had had the power to bring into them before, and beneath which all that exquisite, calm trustfulness, which had been their principal characteristic before, was blotted out as completely as though a livid and alien mask had been pressed down upon them. And such a mask, such a ghastly presentment of unutterable woe, horror, and repulsion, agonized, terror-stricken repulsion, as I had never, in all my life, seen on any human face before, save once, the face of that girl bride who had perished in the Swiss Alps. I had forgotten her. The whole incident had slipped from my mind until recalled to it now, 7 years afterwards, by that never-to-be-forgotten look of mortal, unendurable terror, repeated in the very pose of the poor hands which, damp and clammy in death's closing grasp, were yet lifted up with the palm turned outwards and the fingers slightly curved, as though in a last effort to thrust from her something, or some vision, too horrible to see and live. She was not quite dead, however, though the only sign of life was a faint convulsive shivering of the limbs and lips, and both the nurse and landlady vied with me in striving, by applications of ice, brandy, etc., to recall the fast-ebbing sands of existence, the while the last-named woman answered as well as she could to my horror-stricken inquiries as to the cause of the terrible change before me. "Ma'am, she was going on as well as possible, very weak, but nothing in the world wrong, and the baby, poor thing, is but a measly bit of creature and not likely to live, the doctor says. He had done all as was needed, and was in a hurry to get off to another case he had, so after he'd spoke to Mr. Page, and told him he might go in and see his wife, as was asking for him, off he went. I let him out myself, and then went into the little back room there to nurse, who was tending to the baby. She told me she'd just shown the gentleman in here, and bid him be careful not to excite his good lady, but that, indeed, there seemed no fear of, for he went in as soft and quiet as a mouse, while she was lying smiling on her bed like any angel, so calm and still. And an angel she's been all through, I said, when the words were hardly out of my mouth, but there came a shriek from this room as you might have heard upstairs, and as hardly sounded like her voice, though we knew it couldn't be no other. Nurse and me, we rushed in, and there she was sitting bolt upright in bed with her arms lifted up in her face like it is now, and him, Mr. Page I mean, trying to lay her down and soothe her. We put her back almost by force like, for she seemed quite unconscious as stiff as if she was in a fit, and he began telling us as he'd hardly said a word when a donkey, as was kept in the yard near by, suddenly brayed out loud, and so startled her, she sprang up in bed with the scream we heard, when the nurse here she stopped him in his story and bid him run for dear life after the doctor and fetch him back. "Never mind what frightened her," said she, "but go this minute. She's dying now, and if you don't catch up with him, she'll be gone before you get back." There was a knock at the door at that instant, and with the exclamation, "There he is," Mrs. Critchett broke off her narrative and hurried out. A second later, and we heard her opening the front door and speaking volubly to someone there, then steps coming along the corridor, and another voice, a voice which somehow sent a cold, strange thrill through me, though I had no recollection of ever having heard it before, asking in tones which, low as they were, penetrated clearly to where I stood, "Is she still alive?" Someone else heard that question besides me, the dying woman. I was holding her, supported on my arm. and at the first sound of that voice, I felt a sharp, swift shiver run through her entire frame, while for one instant the secret horror hidden behind those glazed and staring eyeballs flashed into sudden life. The white lips met with a sharp, hissing gasp, and then dropped apart. The hands fell heavily at her side, the eyelids closed. She had died. Died while her husband was still asking if she lived. Involuntarily I sank down upon my knees and bowed my head upon the bedclothes. At such a moment, the moment when a soul is suddenly torn away from earth and set before the judgment seat of God, prayer seems the fittest and only attitude for those called on to witness the solemn change. Another step had, however, already entered the room, and as it slowly advanced to the foot of the bed I looked up, meaning to say such poor words of sympathy or comfort as might come to my lips, to aid the man so terribly stricken in the first recognition of his bereavement. They were never uttered. Instead, I found myself staggering dumbly to my feet, with eyes fixed and staring, and a sudden icy coldness in my heart, as though every drop of blood there had been jerked violently upwards to my confused and startled brain, where and when I had seen before, not this man now facing me, this plain, dull-browed, sandy-haired English clerk, with whose back view only I had hitherto been familiar, not him, but his eyes. Eyes unlike in shape and color every other feature in his face. Dark and sinister, with abnormally dilated pupils, black, sharply lined brows, with a deep depression toward the center of the nose, and irises of a lurid orange hue which seemed to glow and scintillate as with some inward flame. I have no remembrance of how I left the room. Next morning, before I was up, John spoke very seriously to me, warning me never to say to anyone else what I had told him the previous night, and blaming me for letting my imagination, as he called it, affect my nerves and moral judgment in the way it had done. He pointed out to me that sudden death might not unnaturally leave a more painful expression upon the face than a gentler, lingering one, and that it was the recollections suddenly recalled to me by this one when I was tired and overexcited, and not any real resemblance, which had induced me to fancy a likeness between our fellow lodger and the handsome young Frenchman of 7 years back. He told me also that he had seen the former several times, and could not detect anything weird or unusual in his eyes save that they, as well as the brows, were rather darker than the general tone of his coloring warranted, and that from what he had heard from the nurse and doctor, he was of opinion that the poor young woman's death resulted from perfectly natural causes, and such as would most probably be induced in a nervous woman in her condition by any sudden fright or strain to the system. He said this and a good deal more, and I listened and was silent. I even tried to believe that he was right, and did not ask, but was she a nervous woman, or one peculiarly the reverse? And why should I, on whose strength and common sense you have relied for 6 years, and who has stood by you beside many and many a deathbed, and helped you to comfort all sorts and conditions of mourners, turn suddenly, and without any cause, nervous and fanciful also? That evening Mrs. Critchett came to tell me that the baby was dead, and that the widower had given her notice, saying that he could not bear to stay in the house. She added, not that a day-old child can make a difference to him, poor man, and for my part, I think it's better out of the way. It was miserably delicate from the first, and had the queerest eyes, black and uncanny as a little imp's. For that matter, there's something about the father's, heaven forgive me for saying it of him, poor soul, which makes me feel a bit creepy. Did you ever notice them, ma'am? The third time. What follows is taken from my last year's notebook, the Christmas week of 1882. I copied it just as it stands, without any alteration whatever, save as regards the actual names of the town and the people concerned in it. As I am still living in the former, and my husband is rector of the parish, it might possibly be injurious to him or to others were I to omit this one caution. November 25th. Just a month to Christmas, our first Christmas at the rectory. What a stately, comfortable sound it has, and how well it suits John. He seems actually growing stouter to fit it. Martha tells me that the house adjoining ours is let at last. I am glad of it, for it is a serious drawback to our pretty, cheerful home to be obliged to look out on those desolate, weed-grown gardens, that row of gaunt and shuttered windows. It is a large house, too, and one of the oldest in the place. They say one wing dates back nearly 200 years, but it belongs to a family who does not live there, and it has been unlet for a long time. I believe there is some talk of its being haunted, and that tenants will not stay in it. I hope the new ones will prove exceptions to the rule. It is quite cheering even to see the huge iron gate standing open, and painters and glaziers already hard at work all over the premises. November 30th. I have been listening to a terrible story today. A ghost story, too, of all things in the world for a sober rector's wife to give ear to. But as it relates to the Priory, the name by which the house adjoining ours is known, and explains the horror with which even the school children regard that mansion, I thought I might be excused for letting the old woman who comes to mend my carpets give me her vision of the legend in question. I need hardly say that she believes in it most implicitly. It seems that about 100 years ago it belonged to a member of the Thorpe family, who had made a very unfortunate marriage. That is to say, he had married a very young and lovely girl, who had all the outward semblances of purity and innocence, and who, nevertheless, turned out to be as shamelessly wicked as what old Mrs. Lutton calls the baddest lot in town. Not content with being false to her husband, she used his absence in America, on diplomatic business connected with our ratification of the lately fought-out independence of the colonies there, to turn the dignified old Priory into a pandemonium of such reckless license and dissipation as filled the whole county with the scandal of the doings there, and caused her dissolute companions to be publicly hooted in the streets of the little town. It is surmised that she and one of them had planned an elopement to take place before the return of the injured husband from abroad, and so place her in safety from his wrath. But if so, her scheme was frustrated. Major Thorpe returned 3 weeks sooner than had been expected, and was met on the landing by an old servant who had left the Priory in disgust at the scenes enacted there, and lost no time in acquainting his master with them. The scene which followed must have been a terrible one. At first, indeed, Major Thorpe said nothing, but struck down and went nigh to murder the man who had dared to blacken his wife's fame to him. But when convinced of the truth of his story, he lifted his 2 arms to heaven and swore so terrible an oath of vengeance as curdled the very blood of the listener, offering himself to perish everlastingly if for those dishonored 7 months of his absence he might be allowed, not only to punish her who had polluted them, but once in 7 years wreak such residue of his wrongs as her mere death could not atone for, on some other woman so young and pure and innocent as she had seemed to be, and so satisfy his tortured soul for the worst torture that the first woman had inflicted on him. Next day, it was rumored among some in the town that Major Thorpe had been seen in the neighborhood, and one old gardener even swore to having seen a figure which he recognized as his master's, lurking among the shrubs in the Priory garden. But no hint of this reached the guilty revelers within, or perhaps they might even then have escaped the doom hanging over them. That same night, a cry of fire was raised in the quiet old town, and folks, roused from their sleep and rushing to the spot, saw flames pouring from the lower windows of that part of the Priory which Mrs. Thorpe inhabited. The servants, who slept in another wing, were already awakened, and had made good their escape, but all their attempts at rescuing their mistress proved futile, the door coming from the great hall to her suite of apartments being found locked and barred, while through crack and keyhole poured a crimson glow that showed that all within was already a sea of roaring flame. And then, while the shrieks of the victims within and of the crowd without rent the air, and while some ran for water and some for ladders, and some fled hiding their eyes for very fear and horror, there was seen at one of the upper windows an awful sight. For there, during the space of 1 minute, there appeared, as if painted against a curtain of lurid red and framed in the wreaths of smoke, 3 figures, a man and a woman, and between them Major Thorpe, holding a hand of each, clasped together in the iron clutch of one of his, while with the other he leveled a pistol menacingly at the head of the man, whose left arm hung, evidently broken, at his side, while the woman writhed and shrieked and clung to him with vain cries for mercy. For 1 second, I say, this was visible. The next, there came an awful crash, as though a magazine had exploded at their feet, and in a breath the whole front of the house, roof, windows, walls, and all, disappeared and crumbled away in a vast sheet of white flame, which shot high into the air and sank down, carrying those 3 figures with it. No portion of their bodies were found when the ruins came to be searched afterwards, and in course of time the Thorpe family rebuilt the house as it now stands, and announced it as to let, but already an evil name had accrued to it. People spoke of cries issuing from the empty rooms, and of a shadowy male form seen prowling along the galleries of one wing of the ancient building still remaining, or in the deserted garden, and though tenants came, it was only to go again the more quickly. It remains to be seen if the new people, an Indian colonel and his wife, will be braver. But I am half ashamed to have listened to such a farrago of romance and superstition after all. I hope no one will whisper a word of it to my little Joe. He is fond of making his way into that garden and playing there. December 15th. They are come, and I have seen them. That is, I have had a distant view of them from my bedroom window, as they stood on their lawn together. He, a tall, white-haired, soldierly-looking gentleman, with a long mustache. She, a singularly slender, graceful woman, in black, with a large silver cross round her neck, and seemingly much the younger of the two. People who have met them tell me that they are both delightful, and the greatest acquisitions to the place that it has had for years, but I fear we are not fated to know much of them. Colonel Thorpe, he is a distant cousin of the owners of the house, is an avowed freethinker, and his beautiful wife, which sounds far worse in the ears of our good townsfolk, a Roman Catholic. A most devout one, too, Lady Fanshawe, our patron's wife, told me, had set her heart on going into a convent, when Colonel Thorpe met her and fell so in love with her that he persuaded her to marry him instead. A sweet creature, with a delicious nun-like unworldliness added to her new matronhood, which makes me quite in love with her myself. You mustn't call there, however. That bad colonel hates parsons, and swears he won't have anyone from a parson's house inside his. Isn't that dreadful of him? And his wife? I asked. Oh, my dear, didn't I tell you she was a Romanist? And you know the ill feeling here against the late rector for his ritualistic tendencies. It would never do for you or your husband to seem to run after her. Your parishioners would be in arms against you at once. December 23rd. Something has happened which has upset me terribly. I do not know what to think of it, whether I am under a delusion, or am not so strong as I was, or what it portends, if indeed it portends anything. If John were only here. But he left yesterday for Dulminster on a visit to the bishop, and will not be back again till this afternoon. Perhaps, too, he would only laugh at me. Once before, that time in Bloomsbury, he said it was imagination, and now— but I had better write it all down. Perhaps if it looks ridiculous on paper, I may be able to feel the foolishness of it myself. I was going down to the church yesterday afternoon to see about the decorations. There is a narrow lane dividing the Priory grounds from the churchyard, which makes a short cut from our house to the latter, and along this I was hurrying when, midway in it, I encountered Colonel Thorpe. He was carrying a leather handbag, as if bound on a journey, and as it was the first time I had had an opportunity of seeing him so close, I naturally slackened my pace a little, so as to get a better view of him. Believe me when I say it, I had no other thought in my mind, no other motive than the natural womanly curiosity to look at one who is not only our nearest neighbor, but a man of good position in the county, and my first glance at the tall erect figure, the white locks, the long gray mustache, gave me a distinct feeling of admiration. In the same moment, however, I was conscious of a change coming over me, a kind of coldness, mingled with a nervous thrill, which quickened as he drew nearer. Instinctively I hung back, a sort of chilled expectancy, though of what I knew not, clogging my steps, while by contrary impulse, dread, blended with desire, drew my eyes more eagerly to his. A double wave of memory seemed to sweep over me, sharp peaks of dazzling snow rising against a sapphire sky, the scent of heaped white flowers on a silent form, and anon a close sick-room, cold clutching hands, and the wail of a babe near-by. A mist was gathering over my gaze. My hands felt cold, my head giddy, and instead of the man before me, I seemed to see the outline of a window filled with lurid flame, and gleaming out of it a pair of eyes, fierce, dark, with hugely dilated pupils, and irises of tawny yellow, glowing like two hellish coals with inward fire. The very eyes, heaven help me now, as I speak the truth, which 7 years before had met mine over the lifeless body of the city clerk's young wife, which once again, 7 years before that, had lit with such a wild and ghastly glare the dark face of the young Frenchman in the Swiss chalet. And then, in the same moment, the mist cleared, and I saw the eyes only, and knew that they were in Colonel Thorpe's face, and that they recognized me. Aye, believe it or not, they did, and I knew it, not by any process which I could describe to you, but by that nameless sympathetic flash and thrill, that unpleeping something in the gaze which says to you, and everyone meeting it, whether they can answer it or not, I know you. There was no syllable spoken, no pause on either side. We met and passed, and I went on to the church, but in such a tumult of feeling as I pray that I will never experience again, shaken and filled with such an overpowering sense of some terrible impending calamity, which shook me to my very center with impotent terror and anxiety. For what could I do or say that would not proclaim me a hopeless maniac, were I to strive to avert an evil which even in my madness, if madness it was, I could not dare to put into words, could I find words to put it in, and which all the time I feel myself helplessly power to avert? Was I to call at the Priory, to intrude on its stately young mistress, and implore her to fly from her home and seek shelter with a stranger like me, from her own natural protector, the husband for whose love she had given up her holiest hopes and ambitions? And yet it was over her head that I knew the doom to be impending, and hour by hour, as I sat trying to work or read in my own peaceful house, I felt it coming nearer and nearer to the ill-fated one adjoining us, and saw again the mocking, pitiless gleam of those eyes defying me to war against the lost soul behind them. And it only wanted 2 days to Christmas. Everything else looked so gay, so tranquil. I even caught a glimpse of her during the day speaking to a couple of poor tramps at the gate and bringing them bread and meat in her own hands. I must hurry on. When night came, I could not sleep. I had felt better and more cheerful during the evening. In fact, I had taken the trouble to ascertain that Colonel Thorpe had really been starting for London when I saw him that afternoon, and would not return till the next day. The doom, then, whatever it might be, was not to fall immediately on its innocent victim. Providence might even show me some means of warding it off, and directly I felt this, my spirits rose, and I was even able to laugh at myself for my forebodings, and to feel glad John was not at home to scold me for them. But after I was in bed, sleep would not come to me. I was not ill or feverish. My head did not ache. There was nothing the matter with me except that, try as I might, my eyes would not close in slumber. I remained wide awake for a couple of hours or more, and at last, wearied of lying thus, got up and went to the window, meaning to look out at the night before lighting a candle and trying to read myself to sleep. It was then just on the stroke of 1. The whole town was asleep, and over everything reigned perfect stillness. Opposite me was the Priory, shuttered and silent too, and its gardens white with frost, and bathed in the full rays of the moon, save where a belt of trees or shrubbery cast darkly waving shadows on the silvered surface. I was still gazing, when one of these shadows seemed to detach itself from the rest, and glide forward with a motion suggestive of some crouching creature unwilling to be seen. Involuntarily, the old woman's story of the Priory ghost flashed back upon my mind, and I leaned forward to see better. But in the same moment the moon had passed behind a cloud, and the shade disappeared, sucked back into the general obscurity of the shrubs through which it had seemed to be creeping, only for an instant, however. The next, the full silver orb rode out again calm and bright as ever upon the blue expanse, and as it did so, the bushes swayed and parted, and out from among them stepped a tall black figure, which stood erect in the moonbeams. No ghost, but a man, and the man I had thought at that moment far and safely away, Colonel Thorpe. There was no mistaking him, no possibility of delusion. For 2 full seconds he stood there in the white moonlight, dressed as I had seen him earlier in the day, with his blanched hair and lone, curved mustache glittering in the silver rays, and then plunged again into the shadow and disappeared in the direction of the house. January 30th, 1883. It is many weeks since I have written in my diary. I have been ill for almost the first time in my life, very ill. They would not even let me write letters for some time, but now that I am well and feeling strong again, I must add a few words. I think it was about midday on Christmas Eve that the news reached us that young Mrs. Thorpe was dead. The lady's maid had found her bed unslept in the morning, and on search being made she was discovered in the library, a room in the older part of the house, on her knees, and stone dead. It seemed that she had told the maid on the previous evening not to wait up for her, as she had promised to do some copying for the colonel, which might keep her up late, and from her position, combined with the papers on the table and an overturned chair behind her, it was surmised that she had been suddenly startled from her occupation by some sight or sound, though what none could say. and had actually died of fright. Colonel Thorpe was away in London at the time, but by a curious chance had left for home before the telegram summoning him arrived, and appeared among the bewildered and terrified servants within half an hour of their discovery of his wife's body. One of them told me afterwards it was a sight to make the bravest shudder. He was standing there gazing at her, as if turned into stone, and she, his wife, stretched at his feet with that awful look of terror, the terror that had killed her, still staring dumbly from her dead face, and the silver cross she generally wore held stiffly up in both the poor cold hands, as if in mute appeal to heaven. The husband has gone abroad again now, and the Priory is once more untenanted. They say it will be pulled down. After what has happened this time, no one will ever live in it again. With this fragment from my diary, my story ends. I have nothing more to say, and no arguments to put forward. If indeed such a thing be possible, as that the curse of a lost and reckless soul should be allowed to take actual form and shape, and by the mere revelation of one instant of its infernal personality, crush out instantaneously and irredeemably the spark of life in its hapless victims, it is not for me to say, nor is this a place for the discussion of such suggestions. All I can do is state the facts as they occurred. If to other minds they offer an easier explanation, I am glad of it. The end.